Hi, guys. I'm going to take some time here to work through this Miller versus Alabama uh, case brief. Um, what I did here, this was one of the tools that the book suggested at some point um, when you're reading a case to look at the first sentence of each paragraph. So you can see I have them highlighted in here. And that really rather than reading, what do I have, like 12 pages here, you can, once you pull that out, you're only reading like, 2 or 3 pages, and you really get a gist uh, of the case and the essence of the case. So just kind of wanted to work through this way as a different tool. And I figured since I was doing it online, it might be an easier way to do that. It might, you know, takes too long for me to do this in class, but I can have this pre-ready for us here. So I'm going to move this over here. Okay, so I have the case name and Blue Book site already. Now you might notice from here, we don't have the US Reporter site. So whenever I downloaded this, it had not yet been reported in the US Reporter. So they were only giving us these secondary reporters. Um, but I just updated it for purposes of the case brief. Okay, so I have that. Then you'll see down here is where kind of copied and pasted from the full decision. These, like first sentences from the from the case. Okay, so here we have there were two 14-year-old offenders who were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Okay, so back here again, um, this is what we call a consolidated case. There were two cases here which were dealing with a very similar kind of statute and really very similar type defendants. One was in Arkansas and one was in Alabama. So since it's really the same legal issue, the Supreme Court consolidated it. So we have two sets of facts, which is which is a little unusual, um, but we can deal with that. Okay, so this was one of these defendants was Contrell Jackson, who was involved in a video store robbery. Now he was not um, his friend or buddy or criminal, uh, someone who was in the similar criminal enterprise was carrying a sawed-off shotgun, and this guy ended up killing the clerk into the video store. Okay, and then he was given. There was an Arkansas statute that says they can be charged as an adults if you're 14, and he was sentenced to life without parole. Okay, this is so like Jackson. So this is the other defendant. Evan Miller was 14. Um, a neighbor was making a drug deal with his mother, and bad things happen, which we'll go over in a second. And then same thing, Alabama. He was charged as an adult, and this crime, just like in Arkansas, carries a mandatory minimum punishment of life without parole. And they appealed this based on, right here, the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, so let's go back here. When I'm going to jump to my rules here. So these are the laws that we're dealing with. So there was Arkansas and Alabama both allowed 14-year-old defendants to be tried as adults. Okay. Arkansas and Alabama both had statutes that provided mandatory sentences of life imprisonment without parole for homicide, basically, when you killed somebody. Okay. Please excuse my typing. I'm a terrible typist. Okay, so that's like one set of rules, these state rules. The other set of rules is our, Eighth Amendment to the US Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. What is it? I'm pulling this from here. And guarantees individuals the right to not be subject to excessive sanctions. I don't know what I'm doing here. Okay. So they talk about this line of cases. Remember, we were talking about this last week, that when we're dealing with constitutional law, we're really dealing with case law. So there's two cases that they're really relying on here. One is Graham, and then the other is Roper. Roper v. Simmons. Where's Graham? What's the full text of Graham here? I have to go back here. Graham v. Florida. Okay, so right, we have two strands of precedent, and okay, so Roper holds Eighth Amendment bars capital punishment for children. And Graham, I don't know why I have numbers here. That's just how my thing is coming up. Bars life without parole for non-felonies or non-capital offenses. Let's see. Okay, I found it here. In Graham versus Florida, they held that life without parole violates the Eighth Amendment if it's imposed on juvenile non-homicide offenders, right? So that is, if you give somebody life without parole, if they haven't killed somebody, that violates the Eighth Amendment. Okay, so those are our three rules, right? We're dealing with, remember we were talking about inconsistencies of laws, okay? So we're wondering if these state laws that provide mandatory sentences of life imprisonment without parole for homicide, that extends in some cases to 14-year-old defendants, does that jibe with the Eighth Amendment? which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, so are these two laws consistent? Okay, and what they look at are these two cases, Roper versus Simmons and Graham versus Florida. So let's go back to our facts. Okay, so facts. I'm going to move this over here so I can refer to it without. Can I move you? You don't need to see this. Hopefully you can have that up in front of you. So the facts, we have two consolidated cases. One is Jackson, who was a 14-year-old defendant. He was involved in a video store robbery where the clerk was killed. Okay. So that's what happened here. He was charged. What Jackson? That was in Arkansas. Arkansas. He was charged as an adult, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Okay, at some point, I will spell check this. Imprisonment. There we go. This was due to an Arkansas statute which provided a mandatory sentence of life without parole in homicide cases. So this is interesting because our guy Jackson, Cantrell, he didn't actually kill the victim. He was found guilty of what we call felony murder. So if you are involved in a felony and someone gets killed in the course of that felony, you can be charged for felony murder and be found guilty of murder because you're in a criminal enterprise and somebody died. Okay, so that's the Arkansas case. In the Alabama case, so that one you kind of feel bad for the kid a little bit, maybe. Where's the Alabama case? It's Arkansas. Where's Alabama? Okay, so Alabama case is Miller, and Miller, a 14-year-old defendant, he was at a friend's house and a neighbor came over to, I don't know, sell drugs to defendant's mother. Defendant and his friend followed victim to his trailer. They drank and smoked marijuana, and victim passed out. They stole his wallet. And victim woke up angry. Defendant hit him with a baseball bat. And many times. We could just say many times. And then they tried to cover up the crime by setting the trailer on fire, and victim died not from his wounds, but from smoke inhalation. So if they never set it on fire, he might have lived. Okay, so Miller was tried as an adult and similarly sentenced to life in prison without parole under an Alabama statute with mandatory sentencing of life without parole. And again, apologize for my terrible typing. Okay, so here's my issue. If you guys go to the Miller case, in the beginning, they even have this. They have a pretty... Oh, maybe it's in the middle. I'll find it. But they hold, you can find the holding. Oh, yeah. We hold that the Eighth Amendment, this is on page 8 of the case. We therefore hold that the Eighth Amendment forbids a sentencing scheme that mandates life in prison without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders. So since I have that here, that's actually my conclusion. Woo. Okay, let me... Court held that the Eighth Amendment forbids a sentencing. Okay, that's your holding. Okay, so if we know our holding, we can usually figure out our issue from there. Does the Eighth Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment bar sentencing statutes that permit mandatory sentences of life without parole on juvenile defendants? Here, quick spelling review, spelling. Okay, I mean, this isn't really helpful. Neighbor, drugs, parole, statute, defendants. Okay. Sentencing. Okay, so what do we have here? We have our facts and we have our issues. Now, we already have our rules, right? These are Arkansas and the Eighth Amendment, and then those two cases. So let's go to our analysis. And this is what's kind of helpful when we're going to our section where they talk about their two strands of precedent. Okay, so Roper holds that the Eighth Amendment bars capital punishment for children, and Graham says that the Eighth Amendment prohibits a sentence of life without parole for a non-homicide offense. So let me go to my analysis here. Kind of put those in there. Okay, and Graham also kind of says that life imprisonment without parole for juveniles is kind of like the death penalty, right? You have no hope for anything. If you have no hope for parole, you have no hope for anything. And what's interesting, what the big thing is in this one is not that you're giving a sentence of life without parole. Maybe, maybe some defendants would deserve it, but it's the fact that it's a mandatory sentence of life without parole. Okay, so let me go back here. So then they kind of go through what these cases are. So that they talk about. So the case law discusses the culpability of children as defendants. Okay, so we have children are different from adults. Okay, they have diminished culpability. They have a greater prospect for reform. And they are less deserving, of severe punishments. Okay. They have a lack of maturity and an underdeveloped sense of responsibility, which, and they're more vulnerable. A child's character is not as well formed. Okay. And then, this is not only common sense, but social and science. And but supports these conclusions. Let's get this over here. Okay. So in these mandatory sentencing schemes, okay, so they're talking about how bad life in prison without parole is for kids. Kids are not mature. So then they're saying this mandatory penalty schemes prevent the sentencer from taking account, the considerations of youth and children's experiences and backgrounds. By removing anything from the balance, they prohibit whoever the sentencer is from, determining whether the law's harshest term of imprisonment punishes a juvenile offender. And Graham also says that likens life in prison without parole to the death penalty itself. What else here? So then they start talking about, that the sentencer does not have the ability to, which we have here, the sentencer cannot, sentencer doesn't have the ability to consider the mitigating quality of youth in these schemes. Um, there are flaws. These are other cases that they're citing. There's flaws of imposing mandatory life without parole sentences. What they do is they preclude the sentencer from taking into account anything: the offender's age and the wealth of characteristics and circumstances. So, like in the world, everybody loves mandatory sentencing, right? Because we want criminals to be off the streets and be punished for the bad things that they do. Now, judges who are imposing these sentences, if it's not mandatory, they might look at this somebody and say, like, and give them a break. And nobody likes that. Nobody likes somebody getting off. The world where we want to live in safety, we don't like people getting off with, like, a slapped hand. We want them. We want this to be a deterrent to future crime. We want criminals to be punished. So that's why mandatory sentencing is always very popular, like at the polls. But I guess if you are a criminal defendant, they're harsh, right? So this is, there's flaws in these mandatory sentencing, especially with regard to juvenile homicide offenders. Yeah, they say that it misses too much if you treat a child as an adult. Boom, 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 boom. Then they go into court, then discusses individual defendants' situations. That who was the first one? Jackson did not kill anyone, made a bad decision to join in robbery. Okay, Miller, obviously a vicious murder, but, lived with a drug addict mother and was physically abused himself, right? So he doesn't have good examples. Court holds that a sentencer should be able to take into account a juvenile's background and culpability when issuing a sentence. Oops, this is kind of in the wrong spot. Extending Graham and Roper's logic. Conclusion. So what's my question here? Issue, does the Eighth Amendment, oh, there should be a question mark here. Yes. Yes, because a mandatory sentence does not permit a sentencer to take into account the circum of a youth defendant and life in prison without parole is very much like the death penalty. Okay. So, okay, so that was, I mean, this is just a little bit of a different way of doing it. Obviously, it makes it easier to kind of look at those topic sentences rather than reading that whole, going through each paragraph. But that gives you a pretty good brief. So I'll give you an extra week to get this in for extra credit, and I will see you guys in class.